with Heiko. So how are you? Thanks a lot for the video yesterday. It got 400 views so far, something like that. So hopefully you'll get some thousands of views before the election, right, to make a difference. So I'm joking a little bit, but who knows, right? Millions, right? And change the world. I mean, that's what's possible with social media and all this stuff, no?
I'm not so sure.
Not so sure?
I used to be a big evangelist for this, but now I'm less convinced that social media itself is a viable mechanism for bringing about large-scale social change. I tend to think it's become a sort of background thing, and it's a lot about social manipulation, actually, I think now. But I was a big evangelist for it for the internet as a mechanism of social change until the last couple of years, and I've become a lot more cynical about it since that time.
Did you see those videos with Jason Lanier, where he was interviewed on Channel 4, but also is this guy writing about basically there was a huge dream about the internet, but all it ended up being is just a place for Facebook and Google and these companies to like control everything, which is a little bit...
I mean, the Enclosures Acts in I think it was the 18th century, sealed off the common lands, which had a huge economic effect, of course, upon the society. And years ago, someone was making a program about Speaker's Corner, and they sort of compared it. This was about 1998, compared it between the internet and Speaker's Corner and sort of related the two together. And one guy came on there, I thought it was a bit of a nutcase at the time, and he said, the real danger is someone will buy the internet. And that effectively is what has happened, at least as far as the eyeball space is concerned. And then all the artificial intelligence and manipulation of orientation or focus has become a ubiquitous phenomena. And it's less about mobilizing people now for social change and more about segregating them into specific communities associated with the interests of certain big businesses and the direction, the trajectory which artificial intelligence pulls people in.
Because Facebook is basically like a manipulation engine, right? And to some degree, Google too. They can identify what people like, and they just show them more and more stuff of what they like. So it's like this echo chamber.
Yeah, but with artificial intelligence, of course, it takes on another dynamic altogether. So you have on the one side the potential for, like during this present election, there's discussion today about the way in which Facebook, on the news today, about the way in which Facebook adverts are being placed by all sorts of shady characters to influence the election. And so, you know, can you say there's a free and fair election? If there was a chance that, for example, we could know that, let's say, adverts placed on Facebook by big money could shift 1 or 2% of the vote, can you really say it's a democratic election anymore? If a vote is close and is decided by that, then, you know, it's a very sinister dynamic.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I saw something about there was some people checked how much money Russia spent on Facebook advertising, and compared to like what McDonald's or Coca-Cola spends is like less than 1%. It was like a tiny amount. So of course it's a little bit strange that some Russian interest might advertise on Facebook for Trump or whatever, right? But it's like one tweet by Trump, I think, is going to reach 1,000 times more people than all the money they spent trying to like trick Facebook. That's what I saw. Something like that.
I think that's certainly true. I mean, there are giant entities which do play the dominant role on mainstream propagation of ideas. On the other side, I don't think. I mean, the whole Russia saga, I think, is a complete sideline. I don't think Russia has any major influence in politics. I don't think they've got people who can make memes and threads and videos that are of significance in relation to British or American or European politics. But inside Britain, there are groupings who are propagating. For example, there's a Brexit Party MEP who's been funding a campaign in the north of England to attack Jeremy Corbyn without specifying that it's from who it is. It's just anti-Corbyn propaganda. So, you know, and he spent quite a bit of money on it, and that's disproportionate in relation to social media, because nowadays social media is more enclosed, and therefore, you know, your capacity to influence things is going to be greater financially than it is by just sort of spreading ideas, because you're sort of segregated off. So that's an, I'm not saying it's that big a deal. I don't think social media is manipulating the election, but I also don't think it's playing a particularly progressive role either anymore. You know, that's the point about this sort of enclosure.
So just in case for the people watching the video, can you introduce yourself and maybe how much, maybe say how much you want to do in social media in the future? I don't know if that's a joke or not, but would you like to do a bunch of stuff?
Potentially, but I'm more interested in the depth of analysis and also in didactic stuff. So like, I do Speaker's Corner. That's a very traditional mechanism of political propaganda. I've been, sorry, I didn't introduce you. My name's Heiko Khoo. I'm 57 years of age. I've been involved in politics my adult life. I'm a Marxist inside the Labour Party. I am an expert, or consider myself an expert, on Chinese political economy. So my PhD was on Marxist theory of China, and I'm active in the labour movement in Britain in the sense of organising and organising and coordinating and expressing my ideas and trying to input my ideas into the movement. I also do the Karl Marx walking tour on a Sunday morning if people want to come along.
What is the Karl Marx walking tour? Is it because he was in London and you show where he, like, where he's been?
He lived half his life in London, and it's an explanation of Marx's life and his ideas. So it's an entertaining introduction to the ideas and life of Karl Marx. And there's a lot of interest at the moment.
Did he write in English?
Not much. He wrote most in German.
Because sometimes translation can change ideas a little bit, no? But maybe not.
Yes, there used to be a phrase, traduire, trahir, translator, traitor. And there's some degree of truth in that. But if you read Marx in German and English, you know, they've been pretty thoroughly, you know, and most of the translations, to be fair to the Soviets back in the day, they were very thorough about that sort of thing. You won't find that much that was really manipulated by mistranslation in Marx's writings. I've
seen some interesting documentaries. I think they might be on Netflix or something like that, where, you know, they're not really Marxist or socialist or anything like that, but they're like economists, kind of overwhelmed by how much truth they find in the Marx, you know, writings from so far in the back, that he was kind of predicting a whole bunch of stuff. For example, what happened after the 2008 crisis.
Yes, there are different interpretations about what the relevance of Marx is to analysing the 2008 crisis, but certainly in the generic sense that prior to 2008, the long economic boom from really the 1990s until 2008 fostered a certainty within the establishment that they had overcome crisis. You know, and it was Marx who had said that the crises of capitalism are endemic to the system. They aren't a separate part, something that affects it from outside. They're endemic to the very dynamic of the system itself. Now, a lot of people who praise Marx about 2008 actually don't take that position. They think that you just need to reform this and that, and we made some mistakes about allowing too much market influence over. To shift towards speculative financial activity, derivatives, and so on, the ninja loans, you know, the people who can't pay the loans back and that sort of thing, and the packaged derivatives from that, you know, that there was something wrong with that, but there wasn't really something wrong with the system. And I think that argument continues to this day, and it appears that we're on the edge, or very close to, a new world economic recession, which would reconfirm the validity of Marxist theory that capitalism is a system that moves through automatically through periods of expansion and contraction, generally governed by the profit rate.
So I'd love to ask you about China in just a moment, but I wonder if we could, because the election is in 6 days, and hopefully a lot of things can happen. And I was thinking about something, and I was just wondering if you might say what you think about what I'm saying about this. So you know, the SNP in Scotland, and Northern Ireland and Wales, I think they have a key right here. They could play some a really important card to balance the election. I think if they, because there's a lot of talk they put onto Corbyn that he's gonna let SNP, he's gonna let Scotland get their the independence vote or something like that. If they just went out and said, if Labour can form a government with Scotland, with the SNP, and with the Welsh and maybe some of the Northern Irish too, but I mean Sinn Féin doesn't want to participate. But if you can win, and if somehow Remain wins the second referendum, they should just promise not to demand any independence vote in the next 5 years. If they just did that little thing, I think they'll suddenly people, and then they should say that if Brexit goes through, if Boris Johnson wins, then they will basically claim independence, or they will demand to have this independence vote. So people would sit back and say, should we vote for Boris Johnson and basically end the UK? And if there was this thing a little bit more strongly happening right now, I think that could tilt the vote. You don't think? What do you think?
Well, this issue was raised by Jeremy Corbyn this morning in a press conference he gave, or a speech he gave this morning, with press there. And it was a document that showed that the British government recognises that there will be, secretly recognise that there will be de facto checks on the borders between the North and the South, and between Ireland and Britain. And, and that the argument is that will eventually lead to the breakup of the Union, probably a pressure towards unification of Ireland, and pressure towards an independent Scotland. The independent Scotland, I think, will be more difficult if the Conservatives win. It might be more festering anger about the issue, but it's less likely to become a referendum. It would have to be passed by the British Parliament. Now, the alternative to that would be if the Scottish were to do what the Catalans did a couple of years ago and call an independence vote from the Scottish Parliament. Which Holyrood they call it. It's a possibility. I think it's not that highly likely, but you're right that if things don't go well under Boris Johnson's government, which is quite likely, and the social support base they're relying upon to get into power is a new form of Toryism, it would be based upon sections of people who voted Labour historically shifting towards the Tories, a very unstable base. So in any future election, the Conservatives will be in trouble. But if they get a majority, then the independence issue in Scotland will go away, at least as far as a legislative possibility of a referendum would be concerned, for the time being. But then, of course, it would grow and fester underneath the surface and explode at a much larger scale at a later date.
Because of course it might be more like politicizing or something like that, but if there was some kind of credible threat that Scotland, together with Wales and Northern Ireland, or some parts of the Northern Irish politics, if they could stand together and say, we warn you, if you give it a majority to the Tories, and if they do the Brexit, we will destroy the UK pretty much. Not destroy, but split it up. And I think they could maybe make people think twice, giving a majority to Boris Johnson.
Well, the funny thing is that Conservative Party members have been asked about this question and say, are you prepared, or are you willing or happy to give up the Union? In other words, give up Northern Ireland and Scotland in order to carry out Brexit, and a large majority of Conservative Party members said yes. So, you know, Scotland used to vote Labour, then voted SNP. It's never been a conservative stronghold. And so if Scotland were independent from Britain, then England and Wales would be, you know, England is historically more strongly conservative. And so, you know, if they're retreating, then they could retreat to their home base.
Yeah, that's why I would think that they should basically also say that, don't worry, if Labour wins, we won't ask for any independence for at least 5 years. I mean, basically, they'd be happy because potentially Brexit won't happen, and then they'd like to, together with the Labour England, try to grow the whole region, the economy, and then if something bad happens in the next election, they might go back to try to claim the independence next time. But at least give a freeze in like 4 or 5 years.
That's what Labour's trying to press for, but obviously the SNP have to identify themselves as having a unique position, and their unique position is that they fight for independence. And so they have demanded, or Nicola Sturgeon, the leader of the SNP, probably representing the majority of SNP members, wants there to be a referendum in Scotland if Britain leaves the European Union. The issue being then that they want to remain inside the European Union. So assuming that there was a referendum on a Labour type of Brexit, which they proposed to cobble together within 3 months, and then that referendum went in favour of Remain, then the issue would no longer be vital. But if the vote went in favour of leaving the European Union, then the Scottish would understandably ask for an independence vote more quickly.
So I hope we can get to China just in a couple of more minutes, but I was just wondering if there might be another angle, because I'd like to ask you what you think about this universal basic income. There's one candidate in the US called Andrew Yang who's like pushing it like I think like nobody's ever done in recent like politics. He's pushing the universal basic income. Like every American would get $1,000 every month by the government, paid for by, he keeps talking about Amazon paying for it and all the other companies making robots and all that stuff, because there's AI and automation is coming. So how about, what do you think if Corbyn went out and says, hey, every British is going to get £800 every month, that's going to solve a lot?
I mean, one problem during this election was the assumption that the Labour Party would get equal airtime as they're supposed to do by law. But in reality, that's not what's happened. And I mean, I'm still, obviously, until after the election, we can't sit down and, you know, I won't do it myself. But there are research institutes doing this. At the London School of Economics, there's a research department who's been looking at the presentation of Corbyn in the press and in the mainstream media, better said. On the airwaves, Labour is supposed to get equal coverage, but they don't. So they've been announcing radical proposals, including trials of universal basic income. But it's not filtered through to the population. So only a couple of keyword slogans have got through. Most of the manifesto of the Labour Party has not got through to the general public because no newspapers have been covering it, and the mainstream media have been carrying out a sort of, the airwaves have been kind of blocked and filled with all sorts of other rubbish.
Are you saying that actually the Corbyn Labour is talking about universal basic income for the UK?
Yes, it's been in discussion for quite a while. I mean,
are you for it?
I think it's fine. I don't think it's harmful, and it would certainly solve the problems of a lot of people. In Britain, officially, there's a very low unemployment rate, but actually unemployment is quite high. And it's lots of people who've simply declared themselves to be self-employed, and they're just scraping a means of existence. And their existence is insecure, and that would provide some security for people. And so I think it's a viable addition to social welfare provision, and also to, you know, the creative arts and all that sort of thing. You know, there are a lot of people musicians, artists, programmers, people who, you know, want to do a bit of studying and a bit of working, who you know, it would suit them to have a universal income, a guaranteed income, you know, and why not? You know, we're a wealthy country, you know, at least in theory, we're a wealthy country. The problem is the wealth, and the power over the wealth, decision making over the wealth lies in the hands of a tiny group of people.
I just imagine that maybe if he pushed it a little bit more clearly, made it like a big thing, then maybe there'd be a bunch of. But on the other hand, there might be people thinking that it might be crazy, or there's no way to afford it, or you know, maybe it's not that easy.
This has been the problem with the whole of the manifesto of the Labour Party. My own criticism is that the manifesto we had a manifesto in 2017. We should have been pushing on those issues and mobilizing around those issues in the last 2 years. And unfortunately, again, it's this fact that Corbyn is a small group of people who are with Corbyn. Most of the MPs are actually against Corbyn. Most of the Labour MPs are against Corbyn. And so they've been trying to sabotage him year in, year out. But nevertheless, the manifesto is good, but it came out it came out just before the election. I mean, these do come out before the election, but you need to have the issues in the mind of the people beforehand. I don't think you can just spring them on them, you know, one day after another. So it now appears to many people, rightly or wrongly actually, that Labour's manifesto is unrealistic. So they're just proposing things that you can spend money on. So Boris Johnson used the phrase, money forest, not just a money tree, a money forest has suddenly appeared, and you're spending all this money. And Joe Swinson, the Liberal leader, said yesterday, everyone can get a pony. So it's like, you know, Christmas time, everyone can get what they like. Actually, British society is an extremely wealthy society, and we could provide a lot more than what Labour's proposing. Labour's proposing free broadband, proposing free tuition, free education for 6 years for everyone, no matter how old they are. And someone just raised the issue of arms sales, slashing arms sales around the world, in particular to Saudi Arabia and Israel and countries like that. And but they've also proposed a 32-hour working week. 10% of the shares should go to the workers inside the large workplaces, and a greater democratic control over the political process. For example, the abolition of the House of Lords and its replacement with some sort of Senate run by the people. But all these things, you know, that they kind of bypass most people. It probably would have been better to stick to 3 or 4 demands and then raised some constitutional mechanism for bringing in new demands. That, in my opinion, that would have been a more logical approach.
The 4-day work week, if we take the example of Google, for example, they have 4-day work week for all the employees. They have this thing called 20% time, and this turned them into the biggest company in the world. So it's actually proven to be very successful. That to give, basically what they do is they give their employees 20% of their time. They can do whatever they want. They want to spend more time with their kids, they can. If they want to start a new project, they can do that. Like, they don't have to follow what the boss is saying. And if Google can do it and become $1 trillion company, then I think the government should kind of encourage all the country to kind of do something like that and have some kind of innovation happening. People, they can spend time in startups or whatever, you know, like or volunteer, or, you know.
This goes to the heart of capitalism. I mean, the idea of reducing the working week with no loss of pay, and the idea that this would increase creativity and productivity, has long been the argument of the labour movement. In the first international, they raised these demands. In the second international, they raised these demands. That's back in the 1860s and 1880s. They raised these demands on a world scale within the labour movement. It's been forgotten, this, because the essence of the question is very simple. The greater the technological development of man, the greater the education, the knowledge, the transmission, the communication, art, science and culture, the less should be the burden on people to work. Drudgery should decline, and leisure and pleasure and work should be semi-indistinguishable from one another. And in that way, yes, what you're saying is perfectly right. But I mean, a 32-hour working week is one demand, you know, 32-hour working week, 4-day work. But it really needs to be a vision of where we're going towards the future. Technology increases, the working day decreases. And leisure and all these associated activities should increase as well. And then you sort of a vision of this, and that's a post-capitalist vision in reality. Although you're right, in big capitalist companies, this has to some degree been realized already.
So the biggest capitalist companies are actually very socialist in the way they organize a little bit. But how about... Sorry, yeah.
I'll just come back on that because it's an important point. There was a Nobel Prize winner by the name of Roland Coase. I think he died a couple of years ago, and but he got a Nobel Prize in the 1930s, and his Nobel Prize was called The Firm, about the firm. And what he said was, under capitalism, despite all the theoretical analysis that's been made by various economists, under capitalism, the company itself is always a planned entity. So Marx had argued that large-scale production, what he called social production, so the production of large scale on a large scale to meet large numbers of needs, is social production. And social production under capitalism is coordinated socially, so large numbers of people make large numbers of things for the marketplace, but the accumulation is individual. And Marx argued the accumulation should be social as well. So when large-scale production takes over, then large-scale consumption should be matched by that democratically. So rather than private accumulation dominating the direction in which the world takes. So there's elements of that have emerged, which are indicators that the system of capitalism has surpassed its own capacities. And monopolization, oligopoly power is a reflection of that as well. It's not really free market capitalism. It's monopolized, oligopolized control over machines, which allow you to mint the money.
So talking about money forest and rich countries, I was hoping that you'd have a little bit time to talk about China, because I saw a couple of your videos where you talk about China. Can you also introduce? So, what's your experience with China, and what you studied China, right?
I studied China really from 1989 onwards. From the time at Tiananmen Square, I've been studying, researching, analyzing what happens in China. I can't speak Chinese, but to the degree that it's possible, which it is, using English language literature, I've been able to follow what's been happening there and developed theories to explain the dynamics of Chinese development, which is based on a very simple idea that public ownership of the dominant sections of the economy and the banks facilitates the accumulation of capital by the state, which is used for planned investment for development of the economy, social, economic development programs.
Because next week I'm going to Shenzhen, and I've been to Shenzhen many times to do videos, because it's really an amazing city. It's kind of like the real Silicon Valley. I also go to the Silicon Valley sometimes to do videos, but the Silicon Valley basically is just iPhone apps. They don't have any silicon anymore. They don't do any hardware. All the hardware is in Shenzhen. And I saw, for example, some people argue against you. They were like hecklers in one of your speeches. One guy was saying that it's just cheap labor. But actually, when you check at Shenzhen average wages, they're actually higher than 30% of Europe, or maybe even more, maybe 40% of Europe. So Shenzhen is actually really, and I've never seen so many like Porsches and Ferraris and stuff like that. It's very capitalistic city. And so what do you think about Shenzhen?
I've never been to Shenzhen, but I've spent time in Beijing and Shanghai and other parts of China, and I have friends, family, and so on who are there. And my studies have focused around the whole of the economic development of China. My PhD was last year, 2018. So I've gone up to quite recent times in analyzing the dynamics of China's economy. One of the interesting things about Shenzhen is that the way in which technology has been developing there is precisely because they are prepared to break the absurd intellectual property regulations that govern the so-called Western technology sector. So you can go, for example, to large shopping centers in Shenzhen, and you can buy all the components for different phones and make your own phone, but probably illegal to do so, because you're not supposed to put that with that. But because the intellectual property regulations, for example, from an iPhone won't allow you to use their components in another phone. But if you know what you're doing, you can put them all together. And that's, of course, this whole conceptual framework that in the early years of the internet was prevalent, you know, the free software movement, the copyleft movement, that you can build on one intellectual foundation. In other words, one set of coding should be able to be deconstructed and used again at one level, depending on which branch you're going off into. And so this sort of infinite capacity to deconstruct an existing system and to construct it in another way. And that should be going backwards right to the beginnings of this technology to allow us to go forward and to control the technology for the benefit of all, rather than for the benefit of multinationals and giant corporations, and that's why Shenzhen's doing well, in my opinion, because it has that capacity, if you like, to partly break the law, break the rules, and to innovate as a consequence of that.
It is kind of like a dream place for innovation, for startups, any kind of like new innovation, and you can get things done in like weeks. It's like amazing what they do. They have these design houses. I'm going to that, maybe that place you were mentioning, it's called Huashangbei, where there's like all the components, but also some amazing new kind of, it's not only copies, you know, like maybe it used to be a little bit more about copying, iPhone copying, but now it seems to be, you know, a lot of them are pivoting to invention and innovation and making something new. And many times you find stuff that, you know, that's much more advanced. And one example is, for example, Huawei, which is based in Shenzhen. And there's this funny thing going on where the US is very scared of Huawei because they're so much more advanced in 5G, and they have much better technology than what the Americans have. So actually, I think it's not about IP, it's just about protectionism. They're trying to kill Huawei. They're doing what they can to kill Huawei, so the Qualcomms and the other Americans can try to win the future.
I think that's partially true. Certainly, there is a lot of innovation happening in China. The innovation, of course, is based upon the ideas. What I'm really arguing is that on the one side, like for example, Shenzhen as a development is not a private development. It's a giant state-financed development project, which then allows private companies to operate within the parameters of the system established by the state. All land is owned by the state in China to this day. So, you know, the government receives revenue, which it then invests in infrastructure. And that on the base of that infrastructure, you know, the drawing of all the tech freaks from China comes into it and allowing some freewheeling operation. Within that context, lets and fosters intellectual development. And by the way, that's the same. I've got good friends in the art world in China, and it's the same in the art world. And of course, that was the one area in which in the Soviet Union, people used to say, well, that's the most dead and dull and murdered field of intellectual endeavor. And yet in China now, you know, you have flourishing art world, you have a flourishing tech sector, flourishing innovation in thinking, which, you know, is based upon this, the lack of respect for intellectual property. Now, I'll just clarify what I mean by that, because this has also a longer historical tradition. In China, in imperial times, at least from 220 BC, when the anti-feudal revolution took place, the system never had any intellectual property. So if you made a bridge design, or you made a wheelbarrow, or you made fireworks, or you made a compass, you didn't own it. Anybody could copy it and make another version of it, and that there was no intellectual property, and yet China remained ahead of the rest of the world until about 1820. So that's illustrative that the whole intellectual property argument made by Western capitalist ideologues is nonsensical.
So what would you make of this whole trade imbalance that is Trump's main argument for the trade war? The way I see it, I also think that China maybe could play a little bit nicer, and hopefully I'm thinking the EU should go and shake hands with the Chinese and say, hey, come on, take more of our stuff, because it seems that sometimes they kind of block imports unfairly a little bit. For, let's say, for some Europeans and some Americans, it's hard for them to enter the, for example, if you take tech companies, we're doing a video here on YouTube. I'm dreaming for the day China will open YouTube and allow YouTube into the country. I think they don't have anything to be afraid of with all this democracy. It's not going to be a problem. Yeah, they have Youku. It's pretty much like they even copied the name Youku, YouTube, but I don't know what's happening with this trade war, and what's gonna. I think are they just gonna give it up like in a few months?
I think the Chinese were right. For example, I remember going in 2010. I was in Beijing, and that's when they clamped down on Google, and there was an attempt made by the Chinese government then when they realized what Google was up to, and this was also corresponding, I think, then with the Ed Snowden revelations and so on, that if they want to independently channel their direction, they can't allow themselves to be dominated by Google and Facebook and similar giant tech companies that have universal access to information about the Chinese population and can be used to manipulate them. And so they took a position that they will not allow these companies to dominate their marketplace. So they strangled Google. They just strangled the bandwidth. You could get on it, but it took 10 minutes to access your email. So it was a waste of time. And I think that was the right thing to do. And the consequence of that was they attempted to create their own search engine. It didn't quite work, but they made a state-run search engine in which they employed one of the former directors, I think it was of Google as well, and or senior figure in Google, took him on. And it was called Jike, Jike. And then later they shifted because it didn't get the market they wanted. They changed another one, Pang Sorgo or something like that, and but it didn't function either. But the point was they were prepared to do that, so don't expect them not to be prepared to do that. And I think a protectionist policy in China is a requirement for state-led development, and that's what they're pursuing. So I don't think they're going to drop that. And if you look at the news today, the Financial Times covered a story today and a couple of days ago where they're talking about the private sector is declining partly as a consequence of the trade conflict. Lots of private companies are going bust, and they're being taken over by the state.
I still kind of hope that there was this, because I think it would be a huge boost for the Chinese companies to have better access to the rest of the world through stuff like YouTube. And of course, Chinese companies can upload stuff on YouTube, but they're barely scratching the surface of the potential of being part of this YouTube side. Maybe YouTube, what they should do is they should offer China and say, hey, we'll do the same as what we just starting to do with children. They have this new thing where when children get on YouTube, they're not supposed to track the children and give them targeted advertising and stuff like that. So maybe they should just say, hey, YouTube in China will be without any tracking. It'll just be like advertising for KFC or whatever, general ads and stuff like that. And or maybe even it could be a paid service, who knows? And then not have any tracking at all. And some, on the other hand, how would they trust that? Because I don't like saying this on the live stream and stuff and record it, but as Snowden proved, the CIA and the NSA and everybody is basically they have a pretty much like a backdoor into YouTube and into Google and everything, right? That's kind of why they said no to let them in.
Yeah. I mean, the Chinese have taken a position that the internet in China will be independent of the Western internet, and there's a logical position to that. I mean, there is logic behind it because it's an important force in world politics, world economics, and so on. So they foster their own, and to be fair, they've done it quite successfully. Most Chinese people do not think they're being censored on the internet, and they're not, because anything you can find in the West, you can find there as well. It's just, obviously there's a language barrier, and that's the primary thing. So most Chinese people can't speak English, and so they only operate in Chinese anyway. And so the tools and instruments that they use, they do diverge slightly from the tools and instruments that we use. And some of the websites that they have there have greater flexibility than the websites we have here. But again, these are the large scale entities that dominate social media and social interconnections and this sort of thing, which of course always has, you know, the flip side to it in China is you're going to have, you don't at the moment, but you will have large-scale state intervention into those spheres, and it's possible that the state will nationalize some of those large entities that have got big data at their disposal, and just to get the big data, or they will just tell them, give us the big data, otherwise we're going to close you down.
And what's happening with this the Belt Road, the new Belt Road, right? The global trade strategy, what they're expanding, is this to the advantage of us and of all the countries that participate? Is it like a 50-50 kind of thing, or is it going to be mostly in good for the Chinese to trade way more? What's happening in this thing?
Well, China doesn't have an international military presence, apart from on peacekeeping missions here or there. And so China's pathway towards global trade expansion, to facilitate China's internal expansion through exchange of goods, resources, manpower, commodities, and finance, is driven by a plan to unify about 60% of the world market through rail and road connections around the world. They also have shipping, but road and rail are the mechanisms to, for example, unify the Eurasian continent. So anywhere from, you know, India to Africa to the Middle East to Europe could all be interconnected together via networks of road and rail. And it's the Chinese aim to create this network to facilitate the development of China, but also of course, a side consequence of that would be undermining of the position of the United States, whose control over the seas determines the present constellation of world forces, world economics.
So is this going to be a lot to do with railway, and it's a little bit like a competition to this Danish company called Maersk that does all the shipping over these huge ships? Is it to get all the goods faster from China to the rest of the world? Is that what it's mainly about? Or is it also the other way back to China?
Yes, both, but it is it facilitates rapid transit of goods from China to Europe, for example. You know, you can get a train now there are goods trains now carrying these containers from Chongqing, for example, going to Madrid or to Rotterdam, and through that they can transport goods more quickly than they would do by sea. And
they're definitely going to be able to do it more quickly and more cheaply than by sea. So do you think it's going to succeed?
There are difficulties, and the difficulties are that there is a lot of hysteria about Chinese intervention around the world, economic intervention, and it's a political game in many countries to have a go at China about these things. I think China is relatively innocent on these issues that it's been accused of in relation to so-called, you know, using loans for benefiting themselves and making countries indebted. I think generally China sort of makes very soft loans to foreign governments and doesn't really have any sanctions it can use against them in the event of them not paying their loans. So, for example, take Venezuela. They gave something like $50 billion in aid, massive aid to Venezuela. A lot of it went down the sink because the government, you know, had a lot of corrupt officials and so on who were basically plundering the resources. But the Chinese don't have the mechanisms to force the present Venezuelan government or even a future Venezuelan government to pay them back. And so, you know, a lot of it has been hit and miss attempts to create this infrastructure because the central government has said we must do this, and it's such a massive scale, and so many people have been given money to throw around, and so many state entities are involved in pushing that money outwards that that it's not really under any real control of like some guy in Beijing controls the whole thing. No, it's rough and ready, but it's large scale, it's massive scale. And so some of them will work very effectively and will be prestigious projects you can look to and say, this is a vision for the 21st or 22nd century. and others you'll look at and say, you know, you've built a highway to nowhere.
I've seen also some talk about what China is doing in Africa, for example. Are they doing something positive for the African people? Because I've seen I've heard from African people that they say that, for example, they bring a lot of Chinese people to do all the work. They don't hire local Africans to like build the roads or build the schools. And but do you think this is a good thing for Africa? What's happening with China over there?
I think in general, the attitude, and there have been Pew studies, I believe it is, a Pew sort of research study, popular opinion around the world, and they've carried out studies about China's influence in Africa amongst Africans and shown the overwhelming majority of Africans supportive of China's influence. That doesn't mean that there aren't companies who are abusive of the workers and so on and so forth. But in general, China's trade deals with Africa have been to advantage to both the governments and also the people of Africa. For example, railroad networks, road networks, the same type of thing, infrastructure, because the Chinese are building them in China. They've built them everywhere in China. And now they've gone abroad and are doing the same thing. So they're building new cities, new roads, new infrastructure, new hospitals, new schools in exchange for example, copper from the Congo. And so the consequence of that is that, you know, it has brought real material benefits for the people of Africa, despite many problems which can exist along the way and many accusations made against them. Having said that, the most authoritative individual academic who's been studying this for many years is a woman by the name of Deborah Broughtingham. And Deborah Broughtingham wrote a book called The Dragon's Gift, which deals with China's intervention in Africa and exposes that nearly all the stories covered in the mainstream media in the Western world are wrong about China's intervention in Africa. And then she wrote another book, a supplementary book recently called Will Africa Feed China? Which again went through those stories and analyzed all the arguments about Chinese investment in land in Africa and found that, you know, barely any of them bore any resemblance to the truth. So,
I mean, I'm really hoping that this is going to be positive for Africa, or there should be results now already, right? Is it helping Africa in a 100% positive way? Way better than whatever France was doing, you know, with all this colonialism and all this, you know, this history of atrocities. And some people say that the Belgian king was even worse than Hitler, what he did in Africa. In the next 10 years, are they going to be helped out in a big way by Africa, by China?
I mean, the growth rate in Africa, I don't know exactly how much is attributable to Chinese intervention, but I think a significant proportion. The growth rate in Africa for a number of years has been quite positive, and particularly in those countries where China is involved in economic activity there or in deals there. The Western allies or the Western states, France, Britain, the United States of America in particular, Belgium to some degree as well, they have generally taken the view and taken the position, and this was the historical method of imperialism, is that you either send in an army and tell them what to do, create your own civil service, and they copy what you want them to do. In post-colonial times, the same civil servants and same civil service administered the system, and a lot of former allies in the colonial times became key figures post-colonial. And then the sort of present colonialism or present method of imperial influence by the advanced capitalist countries, or the imperialist countries as I would call them, is to demand that if you give money to someone, they must do X, Y, and Z. And they'll always cite human rights or women's rights or children's rights. But in reality, what they really want to do is to control the governments of those countries and get them to do what they want. And the traditional mechanism was very, very simple. And that was, you know, I come to you with a loan to buy your copper, if you're Mobutu in the Congo, for example. And then you give me the copper, I lend you money, you take that money, you buy a house in Switzerland, and you put your money, the money that you get from my investment in Africa, goes to Switzerland or to, you know, the Cayman Islands or whatever. So actually, the beauty about the Western capitalist intervention in Africa has been that you give the money and it comes back. You give, and you also get the resources. So you get everything for nothing.
I'm a half Swiss, so I know about this. Basically, Mobutu family bought like a huge area across the lake, and still thousands of people that are kind of like from the Mobutu clan or something like that. They're still around, but and my father hated the guy and everything because he was born in the Congo.
Okay.
But I mean, sorry about this sidestep. What do you think is going to, because I saw a couple of videos where you were talking about China's investment in green tech. One thing they should do, for example, is Africa is perfect to get the solar. So they should just speed up their solar deployments, help Africa get basically pretty much free power. If you build a nice solar infrastructure in Africa, you have free energy, pretty much. Like there's so much sun, just they could use that.
Possibly. I don't know enough about the viability of solar panels in present circumstances to know whether that's a realistic option for most of Africa. Certainly nuclear power is a realistic option. The Chinese capacity in nuclear power, certainly providing the infrastructure in railways, allows for the integration of Africa and therefore for the greater development of the African economy. As far as power is concerned, I'm not certain about solar power, so I won't make a comment on that.
I saw that there was a few of your speakers' corners sessions that were where you a little bit what's called dubious about some of the green demonstrations and stuff like that. But do you think there's a chance, because now it's very trendy with this green stuff? Do you think there's a chance the EU will do a Green New Deal that will boost the European economy in a good way, or is China just going to be the kings of green tech for the future? Because in China, it seems that you just, if you're the boss, if you're the president, if you are Xi Jinping, or you just hit on the table, you say, I want 10 million electric cars, and boom, it happens. There's no discussion, right? In Europe, it seems that you have to discuss this stuff for like 50 years before anybody decides anything. It's not very efficient.
There's a battle going on in the world market for control over technologies and resources which are associated with the so-called Green Revolution or Green New Deal. Actually, China has had a huge decline in investment in green technologies in the last year relative to the previous period. There were massive increases in green investments, and there's been a massive decline in the last year. I think it was The Economist magazine published a graph about this last week. As far as the overall green issue is concerned, or better said, climate issue is concerned, I am skeptical about whose interests are involved in what's going on. So there are multiple different corporate institutions and global capitalist institutions, the World Bank, World Economic Forum, IMF, European Union, and so on, who are pushing for this Green New Deal. And it seems to be primarily the sort of issue that you talked about there, a sort of Keynesian mechanism for financial pumping of the economy. The Labour Party has fallen for that to a large degree, but some of the proposals are good. So it's about differentiating between what is climate capitalist agenda, and that means just hyping everything to hysteria in order to get money from the state. So, you know, ExxonMobil, for example, in conjunction with Microsoft, has got a massive plan whereby if they make 20,000 of these carbon capture machines, they could in theory capture all the carbon man has ever released. But who's going to pay? It's not a profitable thing until government says, we're going to pay you trillions and trillions in order to build these machines. And so it's about distinguishing in this massive fog that's been thrown in the air, you know, where people are saying, you know, the whole world will be destroyed in, you know, in 1 year's time if we don't act now. The tipping point is coming in 2030 and this sort of thing. This is hysteria to mobilize finances, public finances, to whip up public finance and private finances in order to finance this Keynesian expansion program. And many of them will be duplications. In fact, the type of programs they're proposing, something like 100 trillion to be invested. No one needs to spend 100 trillion on these technologies. You could resolve the problem. If it is a problem, you could resolve it. If CO2 is the key issue, you could resolve it by planting trees or by carbon capture or by 1, 2, 3. You don't need to do all of these things at once, because otherwise you'll be sucking all the carbon out of the earth and everyone will die, you know.
Yeah, the perfect carbon capture technology is called a tree, right? You can just plant a bunch of trees.
There was a study done by ETH University. Funnily enough, one of the key researchers there is a young man called Finkelbein, I think his name is. I'll post it if I need to post it later on. And he was a 13-year-old UN star back in the 1990s. So he was the Greta Thunberg of the day, and he advocated planting 1 million trees a day, a year, or something like that. But actually, they've done a study now, ETH University in Zurich, and they showed that if you planted 1.2 trillion trees, which you can do quite quickly, Ethiopia planted 350 million in a day on July 29th this year. You could easily plant them. It would cost 240 billion pounds, UK pounds, about $300 billion. And they've identified by satellite observation of the Earth where these trees could be planted without affecting any pastoral land. And yet, the main expense being required is actually to purchase land from private owners. And that's 240 billion. That would capture 66% of all CO2 emissions since the Industrial Revolution. So clearly, some people are pursuing multiple agendas to do the same thing. Which obviously then we have to say, well, what do we want to prioritize, and what is the cheapest, what's the most effective, what do we want to prioritize, and what's actually going to resolve these type of issues. And let us test whether it really is true, you know, that CO2, if we can actually control, suck that back down, then we know whether CO2 is driving the temperature or not. I'm a little skeptical of it, but you know how much it's driving the temperature and how bad it's going to get, you know.
So I think let's do it. And I saw an amazing TED talk, this guy, because there's a lot of talk about, we should all become vegetarians and the cows are farting too much and all this stuff. But this guy on the TED talk, he was saying something that really was interesting. He said, actually, you need more grazing animals to fight desertification, because one of the problems is desertification. There's lots of areas that become deserts because actually there's not enough. Before in nature, there was animals who were grazing, and they were like, you know, going around and basically doing the natural stuff that enables plants to grow in all these places. So if you just do, actually, maybe the solution is to have more meat. I mean, in a way, because if you do it smartly, you might solve some issues too.
I think there are two issues there. One is desertification does happen in various places, but the general trend at the moment, precisely because of increased CO2 levels, is an increase in the greening of the earth. There's been a greening of the earth in the last 30 years equivalent to, I think it's at least the size of the United States of America, foliage coverage, and that's according to NASA. So there's been a big increase. About 70% of that, according to NASA, is attributable to increased CO2 emissions because CO2 make plants grow more quickly. Then there's the question of grazing. I think probably, I haven't seen that TED talk, so I can't say exactly, but probably we're talking about free grazing. So you're talking about animals in the wild rather than farm grazing, which is intensive farming. I mean, that'd be my guess. The other aspect to it is, of course, we have these stem cell technologies now that can grow the meat in labs, and that's likely to be on the shelves in the next year or two anyway. And so, you know, human beings will have to then decide on the basis of, you know, texture and so on, whether they're prepared to eat that stuff. If they're prepared to eat that stuff, then there's no real reason why we should have quite as many cows as we do have today.
So one of the reasons also I'm really hoping for Corbyn government upcoming in 6 days is because he's going to pretty much free Assange. He said it clearly, and all these horrible politicians, and I would include Obama in the list, and you know, everybody involved in the last 10 years have been horrible to Julian Assange. They put him in this embassy, and right there in London. Have you been outside seen what's happened around there? And now he's in maximum security. They just want to punish him for humiliating them with this WikiLeaks website. So in 6 days from now, it might be the beginning of Julian Assange being free.
Well, I hope so. But I mean, the peculiar, the most bizarre phenomena is this whole story about Prince Andrew. Prince Andrew has got 5 people who've made sworn affidavits about his activity in connection to Epstein. And then you've got the woman who's accused him of having sex with her when she was underage and her being trafficked to have sex with him. And yet, despite all the revelations about that, Prince Andrew isn't even made to go and attend to talk to the police, not even by video link or anything like that. And yet, Julian Assange, well, they weren't prepared to do that with him with Sweden, and now they're not prepared to do that with the United States of America. And the United States of America trying to get his extradition, and he's in prison without even a charge against him. You know, so the contrast between these two things shows important contradictions and hypocrisy in the whole system in Britain.
So I love this. I love
treated like this.
I love this show, The Crown on Netflix. Is really fun and great. But do you think there's a chance that Corbyn is gonna, what do you call it, not cut their heads off, but kind of downscale the whole monarchy thing? Maybe this scandal that's happening right now might help in that direction. And who knows? The Queen is like 110 years old or something. Maybe whoever's the next guy could decide to kind of skip the whole thing and say, okay, let's turn this place into a museum.
I think that's a good phrase. Turn it into a museum is a good phrase. And part of it is a museum. So, you know, there used to be a guy, Tony Benn, who was a major left-wing figure in British politics. And he used to say, well, you could leave them with their crown and their things, and come out on events every now and again, but you should not allow them to hold any political power. And they always have this in reserve, that in the event of a major constitutional crisis, the monarchy can intervene. And by the monarchy can intervene means the monarchy, the army, the police, and the judiciary, because all of them sign allegiance to the monarch, not to the government, to the monarch. And this, of course, is the ultimate reason why the monarchy is maintained in Britain. It's part of it's an establishment institution of last reserve. If they really need to, they would use the monarchy to overthrow the government, if they really needed to. But most people don't see it like that. And so a consequence of that is that actually, if Corbyn comes to power on Thursday or Friday, then it is then you'll start to see how these institutions combine their forces together and try to oust him.
And if, let's say, he doesn't get to power, hopefully maybe the Queen would consider this and become like the one to save us from Brexit. She could just cancel Brexit. That would be great, because I'm pretty sure Brexit's not going to happen.
That's an example. Well, I'm not so certain about that, but that's an example of the way in which that discussion could take place. For example, around the proroguing of Parliament, in other words, the suspension of Parliament a few months ago, many of the newspapers raised the idea, well, could the Queen decide not to do it? And again, here you have this, she didn't, but here you have this type of illustration of the way in which constitutionally the theoretical power exists to take a decision that is not made by government, but that is, you know, made by the monarch herself or her advisors, her allies, the old establishment.
I think she'd be a hero if she does that, and be a great final episode on the Crown series. Because I kind of worry about the Third World War exploding out of this Brexit thing, because, you know, it's not really very positive forces happening right there with all this. I'm going to put some trade embargo on your French cheese. I'm not going to buy your pudding or whatever the UK is selling. it's like it might lead to something even worse. I'm hoping not, but I mean, no. The best thing is that Corbyn wins and Remain wins in the second referendum. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Looking at you, I'm not sure if you're a Remainer or a Brexiteer.
I voted to remain in the European Union, not because I believe in the European Union, but because I didn't want the xenophobia and hatred that was coming in the air, that was evident in the air, and because I believe in free movement and you know, the right to go and work abroad and people come here and so on and so forth. So those are the fundamentals. If we keep free movement and we leave the European Union, I don't mind. You know, because
Corbyn has supposedly been against the EU all his life, except he's a Remainer right now. Supposedly,
yeah, around 2003, 2004, the left grouping around which Corbyn was involved in at the time was a very, very small grouping called the Labour Representation Committee. They took a position that Labour should support remaining in the European Union and try to reform it. So there was a group of left-wing, I think we mentioned this yesterday, a group of left-wing political groupings across Europe who began to combine together and discuss about an alternative type of Europe. And I support that general type of idea, but I am not hostile to leaving the European Union. It just depends upon, you know, what type of society you have. So this is the fundamental issue. And that's why I think we need root and branch constitutional reform in Britain. In my opinion, we need a constituent assembly as an elected body to form a new constitution that could involve the people and the nations of Britain in drawing up a new plan as to how the society should be organized, which could raise also questions like whether we should have a monarchy or a House of Lords and so on, and then the relations between the different countries. And then you could regulate that according to a new constitutional framework, which engages the people in their debate and in decision-making, and then reformulates the structure of Britain. And then what relations you had to the rest of the world could be decided by that constitutional assembly. Just a word, I should close down in a few minutes. I've got to go and work somewhere.
So thanks a lot for this show. Thanks for your time.
You're welcome.
And good luck over there in the UK. I hope you convinced everybody. You're doing a Speaker's Corners right here. It's called Hyde Park, right? The
Speaker's
Hyde Park.
Corner on Sunday. Yeah, Speaker's Corner on Sunday in Hyde Park near Marble Arch every Sunday afternoon.
At what time?
About I'm normally there about 3:30, but there are people speaking there and arguing there from about 12 o'clock lunchtime till about 7, 8 o'clock at night. All right. Okay. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for your time. And I hope this video gets 1 million views. Then we all. Then we could maybe do another episode. All right. Thanks for watching. And thanks for watching my YouTube. And check out the StreamYard. It's really cool. I think they should be acquired by the Googles, because this should be a default feature inside of YouTube. It's really nice to have this. It's kind of like a Google Hangout on Air kind of functionality. But thanks for watching. And I'm posting a lot of videos. I filmed a whole bunch of videos last week at the ID Tech X show, and they are awesome. And I'm using the new gimbal steady machine, the Zhiyun Weebill S. So it's super steady. I'm using wireless lapel mics. I'm trying to say, who are you, as much as I used to, because then I basically remember to ask people to introduce themselves. And I asked them this before I start filming. So you might not see as many who are yous in my next videos. All right. But thanks a lot. Thanks for watching. And have fun watching all the Trump and Brexit on the YouTube.